All right, so we're recording, we're ready to go. I'm going to invite Sierra Ataleno. She is the Chief Real Estate and Investment Officer at Skid Row Housing Trust. She's an invited talk to kick off this session. And hopefully now you could share your screen, Sarah, if you feel like it. If not,
I'm sorry, Amy, I don't have the ability to make them the co-chair. So I assume you would have that ability. If you go to participants, please, and it should say that make co-host. Hi, Junho. We are having issues with making our presenters co-hosts.
Oh,
I don't have the ability somehow. I can't do that.
I see. So who is the presenter for now?
Sierra.
Sierra. Okay. So Sierra, can you share your screen now? It seems.
Great. Sierra, welcome.
I think, Sierra, your mic seems to be muted.
Can you hear me now? Can you see the screen still?
Yes.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, very clear.
Can you see my screen still?
Yes.
All right. There we go. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Happy to start off your symposium today. I wanted to present Skid Row Housing Trust and give you a little bit of background and overview of our history, what we do, what we're going to be doing in the future, and hopefully answer some questions for you guys. So first up is, what we do. Skid Row Housing Trust develops, manages, and permanent supportive housing, also known as PSH, which is a combination of very affordable housing, case management, supportive services, also known as wraparound services, were designed to address the needs of the most vulnerable, chronically unhoused individuals and families in the community. We originally started, we're a nonprofit 501c3, founded and started 30 years ago with the purposes of solving homelessness via creating homes. Simple concept that's caught on in this last 30 years. Over the years, we've added more things. We've added, the permanent supportive housing portion of it comes from wraparound services. We prioritize residents' health through harm reduction and trauma-informed care. Harm reduction is the attempts to reduce adverse consequences of drug use among persons who continue to use drugs, and emphasize particularly practical rather than idealized goals. We also work through trauma-informed care, which is an approach in a human services field that assumes that all individuals is more likely than not to have a history of trauma. It recognizes the presence of trauma symptoms and acknowledges the roles that trauma may play in an individual's life. We manage 26 properties and we'll be opening 3 more this year, and we will serve more than 2,000 residents this year. And we've permanently ended homelessness for about 9,800 individuals over a 30-year history. How we do it. Since 1989, the Trust has worked to improve the health and safety of all Los Angeles by providing permanent supportive housing and services in the county most impoverished neighborhood known as Skid Row. The Trust builds and operates beautifully designed, high-quality projects that serve as the neighborhood anchors and offer homes to people who need them most. We do that through real estate development. We manage and rehabilitate aging properties in the Trust portfolio, and we develop new construction. We currently have 12 projects in our development pipeline. Our asset management oversees all the buildings that have been built over the years, and it's a 360-degree view of needs of investors, lenders, and the Trust and the residents that keep helping to keep people housed. It's an ongoing reinvestment into properties and to people. We also do property management. Approximately half of the property management team is hired from within the resident community to ensure trauma-informed care. We started doing that about 25 years ago when we realized that there wasn't property management companies out there that really specialized in what we do, specifically not in Skid Row, and understood the needs of our residents through case management, more of a partnership with property management rather than an add-on as some organizations do. Our property managers work closely with case management. Oftentimes we call this blended management, and that it's really management of both the building, but understanding that through the perspective of residents. We also provide health and social services, wraparound case management services to provide residents mental and physical health, workforce development, income and benefit support, and ongoing wellness programming. Groups that promote a sense of community and pride, guidance, and space and time, and so that residents can engage with each other and express themselves in a creative and artistic way. And the big thing that makes us the most different, I think, than others in our space is really that, you know, several years ago, we believed that there was equity in design. Skid Row Housing Trust sees that, you know, good design is part of healing process for people who live in the project. And this is carried through by them in every project that we undertake. And I think that you'll see this in the design within every single one of our buildings. It's more about creating equity, and it's more than just equity in design. It's creating micro communities within a macro community, and understanding that that doesn't happen unless a resident feels engaged in the community in which they live in. We didn't want to create, you know, 4 walls in a box. We wanted to create an investment into the community so that the community at large saw that affordable housing could be something that was beautiful, could be something that was thoughtful, could be something, you know, that was eco-friendly, and really spoke to what the neighborhood is, the surrounding neighborhood is. We don't build buildings and put them in a neighborhood and make them, you know, something different than what the neighborhood already is. We believe in making them an accent and something that, you know, it enhances the overall neighborhood, but doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. Days of the old of projects, so to speak. That they were more to enhance the community. And then for the neighbors that we bring in that are housed at that point, it just helps to create wellness at that. You'll see on our next slide, Skid Row Housing Trust started by preserving and rehabilitating residential hotels. As time went on, our response to the crisis and homelessness grew. We started investing in new construction with fully integrated spaces for health and social services on site. These new buildings embrace the concept of design equity, creating spaces that are not just successful as permanent housing, but are also beautiful architectural additions to the community, demonstrating low-income housing as a community asset. At the Trust, we believe everyone's worthy of safe, high-quality home in a well-designed community that they can be proud of. And here's a brief history of the Trust. So my slide isn't showing up correctly, but I'll give you the verbal. Skid Row Housing Trust was founded to preserve and rehabilitate residential hotels in 1989. In 1993, they created the supportive housing program. And that's the same PSH program that you see now, you know, known as permanent supportive housing. We really founded this in 1993, and with the idea that in order to keep people housed, they needed wraparound services. And then in 1995, Skid Row Housing Trust opened up, property management company was created. Much as I said before, that we realized that there was a need for a specific type of property manager, and one that really believed in our mission. In 2007, the Trust partners with LA County to create Project 50. And at that time, Project 50 was a project that was aimed at housing the most vulnerable unhoused adults living in the streets. And these were 50 residents that the Trust decided to embark on with LA County to see if we could get them housed. It was very successful. I will tell you, Project 50 is still around, and that was located in our building known as the Cobb. In 2013, the Trust really got put on the map with building the Star Apartments. So the STAR opened with the Department of Health Services clinic on the ground floor. It was a partnership that provides easy access to medical services for the community. And fortunately, it is not our only one that does that, as we just opened up 649 Lofts that also has a state-of-the-art 25,000 square foot clinic on the bottom floor. And that was a similar partnership, and that we looked at how could we bring two things that were much needed in the area of Skid Row and partner them together to create healthy housing. The STAR, the also difference of the STAR is that was the first modular housing that was built in the city of Los Angeles. And it came with a lot of growth for the city, a lot of growth for the trust to really understand how modular designs could work and all the challenges within them. And trust me, it had a whole host of challenges.
Sarah,
In
did you want
2006,
your slide to go forward, or you're okay?
I'm okay right there.
Okay, sorry.
In 2017, the Crest Apartments opens, and actually 2016, Los Angeles voters approved Proposition HHH, which, as we know, it was the idea to bring 10,000 permanent supportive housing units into the county of LA. This was about housing those that were the most vulnerable in the city, and ideally those that were living in and around Skid Row. We're still building through HHH, and regardless of how some feel about that proposition or the success of it, buildings are going up, buildings are finishing, and they will complete their 10,000 units over time. In 2017, the Crest Apartments opened up in Van Nuys, and this was the first of the trust community located outside the city of LA, which was a big deal. While there is still a huge need in Skid Row, the trust has realized over time that the need is greater than just in Skid Row, and that our expertise could be used outside of Skid Row to house those that were unhoused and chronically homeless throughout the county. And now we're looking at doing outside of in all throughout California. And then in 2021, this year, the trust will open up 3 HHH funded communities. We've already opened up 2, which is FLOR 401 Lofts, which is 99 units of PSH in the heart of Skid Row. And then 649 Lofts that I mentioned that has the clinic on the ground floor, which is 55 units of PSH on top of the 25 square foot state-of-the-art clinic, full service clinic, by the way, that has optometry and dentistry also in it. And then we're opening up SP7 at the end of May, which will also house 99 individuals. That is a little bit about our history. Here we wanted to highlight FLOR 401 Lofts. We have our virtual grand opening, which is this Friday on April 16th. Feel free to check us out on YouTube. This project is located on the corner of 7th and Wall in downtown. It's designed by Koning Eisenberg Architecture and was constructed by Morley Builders. It's 99 studio apartments with 44 reserved for veterans. The community is centered around a lofted courtyard and includes a spacious community room, meeting room, yoga studio, community garden, bike storage, and is designated services space. It's a 6-story building, and it came under budget with only 1 month delay despite being built in the pandemic. 649 Lofts and SP7 were all built during the pandemic, and all still successes. This is 649 Lofts, also located on the corner of 7th and Wall. So these 2 projects are right across the street from each other. And this one was designed by Abode Communities and constructed by Snyder Langston. It's 55 studio apartments with 18 reserved for veterans. It was built above the 3-story community clinic called Joshua House Health Center and owned and operated by LA Christian Health Center. They'll serve over 7,000 people annually. And like I said, it's full service that includes optometry and dentistry, which is null and void all throughout Skid Row. And then we have SP7, which is located on the 7th and San Pedro. This is designed by KFA Architecture and construction by Snyder Langston. It's 100 studio unit apartments, which includes 81 units of new construction and 19 units of rehab units. It's 7 stories tall and includes a roof deck, a garden, community space, computer room, and designated service space. Right. So that's a little bit about the trust. I'm available and open for questions.
Great.
If you should have any.
Thank you, Sarah. I think we're going to keep going through the presentations. Are you able to stay with us while we go through them and have the questions at the end?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that okay? Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yolande Daniels will join us next with a paper called De facto by custom, de jure by law, housing segregation in Los Angeles. So Yolande, I'm hoping that you can share screen.
Okay. Yeah, it looks fine.
Great.
I believe I do play. Wait, I think I want to do it at the top. View. Sorry, I don't usually use this. Okay. So I am going to be showing research that was actually facilitated by the Research in Architecture funds from USC from a grant that I got last year. I think this is on a timer, but I may try to override it. So basically what I'm showing is a body of research that looks at Black settlement in Los Angeles. There's a timeline that you'll be seeing. The timeline is a timeline of housing segregation and integration in Los Angeles. And then there are several stories that are highlighted in the presentation. This is one, the story of Biddy Mason and the Mason block. There are a series of dictionary plates that you see that were created to highlight specific places in Los Angeles that are significant for African-American settlement. The timeline is basically starting from 1850 when it actually starts with the Spanish settlement of Los Angeles, but things really get going when the Americans take over Los Angeles in this narrative. So it's kind of moving through Black settlement after emancipation of African Americans, then through what's called the construction of freedom towns. So it looks at, before that, the contraband crisis during the Civil War, where there were many freed slaves who didn't have a place to go, and many of them went to the front lines of the war, and then to Black freedom towns where African Americans founded cities on their own. This is actually a little piece that's showing about Blacks in government in the South after the Civil War during Reconstruction, counting some of the freedom towns that they have records for, many they don't have records for. And after this period, there's Reconstruction ends. The Southern rebels are basically reinstated in the South, and then there's a period of retrenchment and basically violence against African Americans in the South, and repressed violence in the North and in the West. And so this is kind of, the timeline is putting together a few things. One is Black settlement, the kind of beginnings of housing legislation, contestation for land, but also kind of civil rights legislation as well. I tried to focus more on housing, but they're actually really tied to each other. So occasionally I'm showing images of people because one of the things that I tried to do in this research was highlight, through the narratives that I found, highlight the agency of African Americans to craft the spaces around them, to fight the resistance that they met in making communities. And so that's basically why I put in some images. And there's this kind of back and forth with violence and terror throughout this narrative, which is essentially a narrative of emancipation. Okay. So this is an image from the bombing of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So some of the images kind of jump around and are not just from Los Angeles. They kind of put it in a larger perspective. After the kind of period of, I guess, violent retrenchment after Reconstruction, then we sort of entered a period where things like restrictive covenants were used to control the ability for minorities to settle in specific places. And restrictive covenants were used a lot in Los Angeles and California and the West. The red maps, I forgot to explain, are maps that are mapping these historic settlements. This is Central Avenue from downtown, kind of moving along Central Avenue from downtown, mapping historic settlements onto the contemporary map or city of Los Angeles. So here there's a plate that's highlighting Bronzeville, which was a short-lived community during the Japanese internment, actually, where African Americans dwelled in Little Tokyo during the wartime, made a community, and then after the war were kind of like disbanded. So there you have like two narratives of kind of enforced settlement and, you know, kind of overlapping each other. And this is just a little further down Central Avenue to the Dunbar Hotel, which was a hotel that was built by an African-American couple. There's also the narrative about the real estate, the growth of the real estate industry and the real estate association, the main board that promoted restrictive covenants. And this neighborhood in particular, Sugar Hill, the West Adams neighborhood, was really, really important in that in the legislation against restrictive covenants. They won their case, but another case went to the Supreme Court, Shelley versus Kramer, and restrictive covenants ended. But that neighborhood suffered still because the Santa Monica Freeway bisected the neighborhood. It skirted USC and went through this neighborhood instead. So this is going on, showing just more housing legislation getting kind of closer to the present, and it's this back and forth. So the de facto de jure is basically laws that are passed top down from, you know, the highest Supreme Court, and actions that are made from the ground up, which could be just actions of citizens, but also actions of local governments, and how there's this kind of back and forth between them, where, you know, sometimes it's the citizens and the local governments kind of pushing and influencing the federal government, and other times it's the federal government kind of clamping down or reinforcing onto the populace. So now it's kind of going into the 60s where the violence is actually violence against repression, and this kind of violence that came to shape cities, the cities that we've inherited, basically. After the Fair Housing Act, more recently, it was an act without enforcement. So in the Obama administration, an enforcement rule was added to it, but in the Trump administration, the enforcement rule was taken away. And the language for these laws is very interesting, because what I found is the more flowery the language gets, the more it's trying to hide some atrocity. But anyway, so this is just ending with shots of the exhibit that's up right now, where the component of this research that consists of the maps and the dictionary plates and this model, which compresses the timeline and the dynamics of integration and housing integration and segregation in this kind of light blue model in the FLOR. This presentation is about that research, and that's basically what I'm working on now. So that small part is itself a bigger body of work that has to be, this has to be kind of unfolded and expanded.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for giving us 5 more minutes of time, because we're going to need it to stay on time. So I really appreciate that. It was terrific. Let's see. Next up is Allison Hirsch, and she will be discussing landscape in the working country, histories, practices, and design futures for Fresno and the San Joaquin Valley.
Thanks, Amy. The sound for me is a little broken up. I hope I'm not unstable in terms of my Wi-Fi, but can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, I think I'm the one that was unstable. You sound great. Okay,
fabulous. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, organizers. Yolanda, I really hope I get to New York before May 31st. That was great. So I'm actually also I'm going to set a timer for myself because I can talk about this for a while. I'm also going to be talking about an ongoing project that was funded by a research and architecture grant through the USC School of Architecture. It was also funded from the Landscape Architecture Foundation's, I think it's called the Innovation and Leadership Fellowship. And it actually incorporates a number of students in the research team. So I'm excited to feature some of their work. So the primary impetus of the project considers cultural theorist Raymond Williams' oft-cited claim that a working country is hardly ever a landscape. And it's through a close examination of land and agricultural labor in the San Joaquin Valley, which is the southern portion of California's 430-mile long Great Central Valley, and considered one of the breadbaskets of the world, or the nation's, quote unquote, salad bowl. And the project has and will yield outcomes that first interpret the San Joaquin Valley's environmental and cultural histories and practices through archival and its sustained forms of action research, which I'll explain, and develop a series of visions for the future, imagining landscape otherwise in these new narratives of justice and equity. The objective is really to bring to light the racialized landscapes of labor exploitation and environmental violence, as well as the narratives of resistance in the San Joaquin Valley as a starting point for visionary futures. And the project focuses on the intersections of land, labor, and justice to arrive at a landscape ethic for the working country and its connection to our global food system and its tenuous futures. This is just a sense of orientation. We're talking about largely the lower San Joaquin Valley. You can see the greater Central Valley of California, that very distinct geomorphic profile here in California. But the focus of the study is largely on the lower San Joaquin Valley, or the Tulare Lake Basin. The objectives, I won't necessarily read these all to you, but I've already mentioned the first, to bring visibility to structural, environmental, and spatial inequalities in the landscapes upon which we all depend as food consumers, particularly by collaborating with communities and organizations working for incremental and systemic change on the ground. To understand and convey the specificities of this unique landscape as one whose truth hasn't been comprehensively told. I will talk a little bit about how it has been told, but I'm hoping to elaborate or contribute to that broad breadth of literature. To see the landscape as an interconnected system rather than a series of singular problems to be solved. Those problems are sort of dense and intersectional in a number of ways, but hopefully I'm trying to parse out how they can be thought of as a system to be approached in its broadest sense, but also in incremental interventions on the ground, to narrate across scales, as I've already mentioned, and to really assert landscape architecture's potential for leadership in taking on challenges of global food production, climate justice, and spatial equity. I did want to feature that I am working very closely with a research team of students in the landscape architecture program, and you're seeing their names and faces here. They are essential to the development of the ongoing research. So Andrea Binns, Lauren Kubakub, Nahali Doshi, Jared McKnight, Anna Mangino, and Jade Orr, who's actually serving as a research associate. She graduated a couple of years ago, but has stayed connected. So here you're seeing a screenshot from Cal EnviroScreen. Some of you might be familiar with this index. It's called a vulnerability index, and it measures environmental burdens against other population characteristics. You could actually see the very distinct outline of the San Joaquin Valley by the red color, which is actually indicating just how high that vulnerability is. The San Joaquin Valley is a nexus of some of the most pressing environmental questions of our day, particularly as they pertain to global food production. That includes climate volatility, rising temperatures, exhausted water systems, degraded air quality, contaminated soils and groundwater, food insecurity despite the agribusiness economy. It's kind of an irony. Extreme environmental and social inequity that is a manifestation of generations of discriminatory practices, high concentration of poverty and unmanaged growth around its urban centers, with Fresno and Bakersfield really being the primary metropolitan areas. In addition, as I imagine many of you are familiar, immigration policies have caused heightened fears of deportation and have created looser regulations for worker protection. And while the acutest fears have started to subside, there are still legacies of trauma created by the past 4 years in particular. The physical landscape of this capital-intensive agricultural model is laced with agrochemicals, as well as animal waste lagoons, meat rendering plants, air and ground emissions of trucking and industrial processing. Groundwater has been extracted so dramatically and swiftly that the irreversibly collapsing aquifer is reshaping the face of the earth. You can literally see subsidence from space. More positively, the San Joaquin Valley has been the host to immigrant populations throughout its history who have shaped the character and culture of the region. So it's a landscape of extremes, but its cultural resilience provides a sense of optimism. And it's within that sort of challenging context that the project aims to tackle questions of food and climate justice, spatial equity, and the role of landscape architecture in those pressing concerns. It's also, for those of you who are in California, I imagine many of you are, it's referred to as the quote unquote other California. And that's largely for its contrast to the California that's embedded in our popular imagination, as well as for its righter political leanings, its climate and terrain, and its economies as the food basket of the world. Many of us have just sort of driven through it and on the I-5 to get from one metropolitan or coastal city to the other. It has always remained outside of the sort of Jeffersonian ideal of the yeoman farmer living off the land. The land once supported a diverse ecosystem, including prairies, oak grass savannas, desert grasslands, as well as riparian woodlands occupied by and cared for by the numerous tribes of the Yokut people. Here, MLA student Andrea Binns worked to understand pre-colonial conditions and processes of landscape change, as well as indigenous foodways this landscape provided. And some of this research will contribute to the narratives for the future as the research moves forward. Here you're seeing the crop map. Using fewer than 1% of US farmland, the Central Valley supplies 12% of US agricultural output by value. And it produces 1/4 to 1/3, it's sort of debatable, of the nation's food, including 40% of the nation's fruits, nuts, and other table foods. It also has this sort of ever-growing global market to countries such as China, India, Japan, Mexico, and so on. I can't talk about the Central Valley or the San Joaquin Valley without addressing water extraction, conveyance, and allocation. So really through the complete reshaping of hydrology in the region, the valley became one of the most productive landscapes in the world. You can see partially by the map that Lauren Kubakub is developing in terms of the primary infrastructure, that water is transported over vast distances and heights through large canals, aqueducts, dams, reservoirs, pumping plants. And surface water rights are reserved in 95% for farmers, which large-scale operations, the most capable at maneuvering the system to outbid small farms. And that's while the majority of the residents are left to rely on groundwater for drinking. And that idea of the residents relying on groundwater might not have mattered had it not been for chemical runoff from pesticides and fertilizers that concentrate due to the particularities of the valley's geologic profile and the retreating aquifer due to over-extraction. Here, Lauren and I are trying to get a sense of all the different agencies that oversee the different water systems. Even though these are major infrastructure projects provided enough water to supply 8+ cities of the size of New York, it has not been enough to meet the demand of growing industrial agriculture. And as a result, growers turned to groundwater wells to supplement their surface water, leading to overpumping. As I've already mentioned, the depletion of the aquifer and ultimately land subsidence. So here you're actually seeing the construction of a groundwater well in the Westlands Water District, which can go down to about 2,500 feet to get fresh water. And it's clearly only the farmers with abundant financial resources that can afford to send a well that deep. The rest are typically left with dry wells, often contaminated by agrochemicals, nitrates, or arsenic. And so this heavily subsidized water facilitated the development of these large farms of labor-intensive vegetable, fruit, and increasingly nut crops, while also affording many farmers the opportunity to operate dairy farms and cattle ranches. So much of the valley is still heavily dependent on an abundant supply of seasonal workers. With diversified specialty crop farming, labor became an increasing issue, and what was needed to operate these capital-intensive farms was a highly mobile wage labor force, preferably to farmers in oversupply so that they could keep wages low. They were able to maintain that oversupply through the dependence on easily exploitable immigrant labor in the 19th century through today. And here you are seeing the dehumanizing practices of the Mexican, oh, that's 10 minutes, wow, bracero program, where one farm worker is being sprayed down by chemicals at the end of a long day on the right. This is a student focusing on the control of migrant workers through the racialization of their bodies via the Bracero migrant worker program in the 40s through the 60s. And it was during the Great Depression that the realities of the, quote, working country gained visibility, largely because it was white bodies that were the subject of suffering. And this visibility was shaped through the writings such as John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, the Farm Security Administration photographs, such as Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother series, which you're seeing on the bottom. Today, the demand for cheap labor has been filled by the most vulnerable, and this is spinning. Many indigenous Mexicans from the southern regions, particularly of Oaxaca, have been crossing the border in numbers since the 1970s, and they represent much of the farm worker population in California and are highly vulnerable in terms of often speak no or very little Spanish. They have limited access to information about legal rights and protections, and they often remain invisibly housed in substandard and informal arrangements. I won't go into the history of this because of time, but by removing sort of thousands of labor camps that once provided shelter to most of the state's farm workers, the work of finding and paying for housing has been outsourced to under-resourced farm workers themselves who are unable to pay for market rate housing, so live in these substandard conditions. And as a result of this sort of continued immigration, the loss of labor camps, by the 1980s, scores of rural towns were transformed into farm labor enclaves. The farm labor contractor model, which is a model of labor recruitment where the main recruiter and employer of short-term and temporary crop workers are the contractor rather than the grower, that has made it possible for once migratory workers to settle in the San Joaquin Valley and work in different capacities throughout the year. So in the field for a highly extended season of diverse crops, as well as in the factory. And so what's critical about this is that the sort of stereotype of the migratory farm worker has remained. in policy, in the sort of political minds of those who are actually primary decision makers, and sort of convincing those with power throughout the decades to avoid the question of permanent affordable housing and community development for a population upon which the world relies. I'm going to skip forward, but here you see some of the infrastructure in these communities, including actually a park on the lower right that was part of a community development federal funding, but the community itself can't afford to water it. So it's sort of this dusty terrain here. Okay, 2 minutes. Wow. Okay, and I'm going to skip forward. It's too bad because, well, I don't think I can talk about it without talking about this process. So through forms of selective annexation by cities, communities of colors have been strategically left out of municipal services. And here you're seeing Fairmead in the center of the slide, which is a historically Black town settled in the 1930s and 40s. And the town of Chowchilla in the upper left recently annexed land adjacent to Fairmead on which 2 prisons stand, but not in Fairmead itself. So that continues to deny them access, the community of Fairmead and communities like it, to the most basic features of a safe, healthy, and sustainable neighborhood. Most essentially, potable water, a sewer system, safe housing, public transit, parks, sidewalks, streets, and so on. And so when you're not included in municipal water systems that treat and distribute water, these incorporated community residents rely on a fragmented patchwork of small and underperforming systems that predominantly rely on groundwater. And this author of this article says, today, the legacy of segregation in the Central Valley reverberates underground through old pipes, dry wells, and soil tainted by shoddy septic systems. There's a long history of Black occupation of these particular communities for the reason that they didn't have water. It was the only communities in which they were able to access property. And this largely has to do with restrictive covenants that Yolande was talking about. These small towns are now predominantly Latinx and are among the first to lose water when drought comes. And when it does flow, it's often tainted by chemicals, including nitrates, as well as failing septic systems, arsenic, and coliform. So it's the slow violence, I argue, and this is a term used by Rob Nixon, as a sort of registration of landscape that actually makes corporally manifest the toxic layering of cumulative impacts of environmental contamination of air, water, and land. And that takes the form of a number of different chronic and acute illnesses in the bodies of those that are most exposed. I'm going to skip forward because of time crunch. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the process
that is the end of your 15, so make it super short if you can.
Okay. I wanted to talk about action research methods. So the primary sort of organizational, the research moving forward is a collaboration with primary organizational partners in the Valley. So the aim is to directly engage communities most impacted by structural inequalities and environmental injustice. So part of this process is actually understanding at a large scale the mapping of who owns the land, and that's actually takes a lot of investigative research that's largely being done between Lauren Kubakub as a GIS specialist, to really understand what are the consolidations of land and power in this valley, and doing key informant interviews with those that are working on the ground directly with those communities. I won't talk about that, but I will say that in terms of, this is my last slide, community co-learning is primary to this process. And with my students, we are working very closely with Valley Forward, which is a community partner, which is a youth of color leadership organization dedicated to social and economic justice on the ground. And they're providing an insight into the sort of hope, streams, and desires in the Valley from those who have worked, lived, and raised family there. And so the portion of this is to actually generate sort of visual narratives and curating them to collectively to generate some big visions for the equitable reconception of the San Joaquin Valley, and possibly visualize these ideas as part of the culminating outcomes. And with that, I'll stop.
Thanks so much, Allison. That was awesome. And I would love to have heard the whole shebang, but I want to be respectful that we have a student panel at 11:20, so that's the crunch that we're under. We're going to do a little bit of a swap here. Rebecca Choi is going to go first, and then Jeff Winoyan. So next up is Rebecca, and she is going to talk about Black architecture, race, and erasure in architectural pedagogy and practice from 1950 to 1970. So thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Jeff, for being so flexible. I'm also a recipient of the faculty research grant, so I'll just give you a broad overview of some of the work that I've been working on. My book project, provisionally called Black Architectures, is really a reflection of almost a decade of thinking about civil rights and Black power philosophies on architecture. And the catalyst for this book specifically is that some of the foundational ideas behind, say, Black power, especially the idea that racial injustices are connected, that racial violence is spatial, and that spatial injustices and racial violence are related. These entanglements are even more pointed now than ever before. Racial violence is more visible, and the spatial systems that perpetuate racial violence is, I hope, more obvious to more people.
Becca, I can't see your slides. I don't know.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was going to say that as well.
Now
Well,
can
I
you see
think
them?
whatever you chose to share isn't quite big enough for.
How about if I do this? Now, is that sharing?
Yes, perfect.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so thanks, Allison. You know, I'm hoping that, you know, spatial systems that perpetuate violence is more obvious to more people today. For instance, now redlining, blockbusting, policing and charging and sentencing, each of which operate at the scale of the geographic ground plane, are understood, I hope, as linked. So now when we talk about Breonna Taylor's killing by Louisville Metro Police, generally, again, not everybody, but I hope more people are attuned to the fact that her death was related to a gentrification project, that the raiding of her apartment sanctioned by a no-knock warrant linked to what the police called place-based investigations are precisely what racial justice movements like BLM and abolition planning seek to address. At the time I began thinking about social activism and architecture in 2011, and the project really, I had just finished my master's in urban planning, where I had written somewhat naively about artist districts for Herb Wesson's Council District 10 in West Adams. I interviewed activists from SAGE, the Strategic Action for a Just Economy, who were really advocating then, as they are now, for tenants' rights, equitable development, and healthy housing. And remember, 2011 was also Occupy. And so the question, why don't we know more about civil rights and Black power movements and their influence on architecture as a discipline and a practice, weighed heavily. And there wasn't a simple answer to it, despite the fact that we know a lot about architectural production in the 60s. We know a lot about civil rights, and to a degree, the various philosophies that underpin Black power. But the particularities, especially of those social movements that existed and operated at a neighborhood level, the coalitional imaginaries, the activists in the street that made specific demands and varied from location to location, are often not discussed in architectural history. In my research, I look at different modes of responses by architects and architects in training, the profession's reaction to and confrontation with the Citizens Committees Against Urban Renewal Development in Philadelphia. I look at shifts in architectural curricula at Yale at the time the Black Panther Party in New Haven and the polarizing arrest of Bobby Seale was most visible. And I look at coalitions like CORE in Harlem, demanding the abolition of police. I want to write about projects that have garnered a lot of historical attention, because even though civil rights and Black power were so critical to the development of activist thought in architecture, the details are already starting to fade. Each chapter shares a narrative that aren't always linear and takes well-known keywords used in liberal architecture and planning circles, such as community engagement, participation, advocacy, workshopping, and fieldwork. And I try to create and craft an alternative genealogy to these terms that have been so naturalized in our field that they almost don't bear a history. In the first chapter, I talk a lot about the word fieldwork and the color line by presenting one street in Philadelphia through the lens of two figures, W.E.B. Du Bois and Denise Scott Brown, and their respective use of the term fieldwork. I put them into conversation with one another. And while they wouldn't normally be discussed together, especially because of chronology, in my narrative, they're connected through their study of South Street. The second chapter is really focused on Black lived experience and Black socialities, and how Black architects in training questioned and at times outright rejected terms like community engagement and advocacy as part of a white caretaker tradition. I talk about the Black Panther Party and the Yale School of Architecture together because of Yale's preoccupation with and investment in whiteness. And I don't use the term as a catch-all word for any architect who's racially white, but specifically through Cheryl Harris and Kimberly Crenshaw's definition, where I chart the way the broader architectural culture at the School of Architecture at Yale was preoccupied with maintaining the sense of authority in being white and all of the material benefits that accrue to whiteness. I present how Black architects in training at Yale created alter architectural pedagogies that transferred emphasis away from property regimes and the development cycle by supplanting whiteness as property with acts of counter-hegemonic Blackness and concepts for Black urban futurities. The third chapter, which I'll share a little bit with you today, centers on the resistance efforts of Black and Brown communities in Harlem expressed toward urban renewal projects, with the main goal of showing how the ever-changing forms of anti-Blackness and systems like architecture mutated to keep racial hierarchies in place. In 1990, Laila Abulagad, in her essay, The Romance of Resistance, recalibrated the relations between power and studies of resistance by inverting Foucault's assertion, where there is power, there is resistance, to read, where there is resistance, there is power. In the article, she demonstrated how studying resistance can be much more than looking at examples of modes of resistance themselves, whether they're carried out at the scale of large-scale social movements or as non-organized moments of pushback. Spatialized resistance, irrespective of scale, anchor all of my case studies. In other words, studying resistance for me is the means, the entry point to examine architecture and all of the complex ways it wielded domination. And in a very abstracted way, we see this in Harlem in 1964, right after the so-called riot, where a constellation of three identifiable New York entities, Harlem, MoMA, and architects working in the mayor's office, responded to uprisings, protests, and community activism in Harlem by creating a space for themselves within city and regional governments, and in particular in doing so through the aegis of urban design. Take, for instance, this photo taken in the summer of 1964 in Harlem, just days after the killing of James Powell, a 15-year-old Black boy who was shot and killed by an off-duty white police officer. The photograph, taken by Marian Trukosco, takes us into the streets of Harlem to provide a sectional view of grassroots activism. The demonstration was led by this figure, Chris Sproul, the chairman of the Downtown Division of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality in Harlem. And the words "Stop Killer Cops" draws us into the street. The photo has an intensely divided quality to it, both in content and in composition. The brick wall fills the upper half of the picture plane, with bodies in the foreground creating a horizon line. The view is also divided. The photographer offers a view from behind the body of two policemen who create a gap just wide enough to frame the protesters that stand behind, facing the camera on the other side. The image invites us to attune ourselves to the spatial practice of what Robin Kelley calls Black freedom dreams, the mobilizing campaigns demanding community rights, civil rights, community control, and self-determination. In this photo, you see 75 demonstrators from CORE, but by noon, the Progressive Labor Party and the Organization of Afro-American Unity arrived. And while civil rights groups such as CORE and Black nationalists like the PLP and AAU each endorsed very different approaches to arriving at their demands, the significance here was that they were all present there on 67th Street. And the visibility of activists in the street is what of interest is what is of interest for me for two reasons. One is because the chapter really hinges on architects who were aware of, but actively worked to avoid on-the-ground resistance. And I make this argument by presenting how a group of architects who were simultaneously teaching at Columbia, working in the mayor's office, and displaying housing schemes for Harlem at MoMA, created something called banking air that the architects in question developed and first visualized at MoMA in the wake of the Harlem Uprising. And my understanding of banking air really widened this last summer with this faculty research grant, where it went toward going through and transcribing just pages of oral histories. And it was in reading oral histories and the architectural plans for projects that would benefit from the concept of banking air that I realized that the idea of banking air was, on the most basic level, as the name suggests, yes, rooted in the buying up and stockpiling of air, similar to the practices of speculating on financial packages carried out by the New York Stock Exchange. But what I argue is that banking air was much more than simply about market development. It was a racially motivated form of governmentality, born specifically as a response to and avoidance of mobilizing minority voices in the streets of New York in the 1960s. And so second, the visibility of the protesters also matters because of the culture of resistance that these social movements created. And a lot of the book, and in particular this chapter, uses the poetry and calls to action of the poet activist June Jordan, who had her own charged relationship to Harlem. So I wanted to connect people in places and discuss figures not typically included in architectural history. And in many ways, I'm trying to create a methodology, a toolkit, by presenting those who resisted and were not subsumed by development markets and the capitalist state. And that's why in my last chapter, I talk a lot about what I call new Black horizons by presenting subversive poetry, music, and alter world making ambitions by figures like Sun Ra, June Jordan, the last poets, alongside the work of Black architects in training who recalibrated, rethought, and reimagined architecture and planning practice anew. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Really appreciate it. And let's see, Jeff. Jeff Van Ooyen is going to talk about composite communities, design innovation towards resilient composite housing in Los Angeles. So bring us home, Jeff. And then we will probably only have, it's going to be our choice at 11:20 is the beginning of a student panel. We'll at least get 5 minutes in there and then allow a bathroom break of conversation, but it will be tight.
Okay, Amy, thank you very much. I will set my screen to share here, just 1 moment, as I try to do a full screen share. Amy, are you able to see my title slide as a full screen? Okay. And hear me. All right. Well, thanks very much again to Junho Choi for organizing today's event. I wanted to talk about composite figures, which is design innovation toward resilient housing communities in Los Angeles. This is a topic I've been working on for quite some time. And what I'd like to do is just share some of the background of the research, and I'd like to be able to go through where we are with students. I've been organizing this research as directed design research with graduate thesis students. working toward new prefabricated housing solutions in Los Angeles using composites, FRP, otherwise known as fiberglass, and the idea of some sort of cloth and a matrix resin holding it together to create new prefabricated lightweight construction technologies. I'm going to fly through some slides very quickly and just talk about the history of my work, where this started, and where it's heading. This is work in my practice doing private residential design work. This is a house in Malibu, California. Lots of focus on light and view and the relationship between housing and the natural environment. This is very removed from the type of work that I will get to, but it's also very connected. My explorations with architecture and how to deal with residential space and how to teach students about residential space comes out of the work that I've done in my own professional practice. Issues of geometry, issues of connection to site constraints, issues to modules and changing dimensions of modules. This is a small pavilion in China, the Nap Pavilion, made of prefabricated wood parts built with students and used as a community resource in the bucolic landscape of outside of Xi'an. And then looking at environmental systems, sustainable systems of developing for climate change. This is designed for a house in Puerto Rico, looking at how movements of sand and wind and tide through storm surge might impact the design and how the design may impact the site. Looking at issues of new spaces and new technologies, thinking back to modernism and how in modernism there was an emphasis on new technology, this idea of machines that would push through nature, and thinking, is this really appropriate for the 21st century? How would residences and residential design work now? Well, what if it was a newer material instead of concrete and reinforced steel from the 19th century being applied to 20th century architecture? What if 20th century materials were applied to 21st century architecture? Lightweight, strong composite materials. Looking at sailing, how boats might respond to the natural environment. This is designed for a STEM technology lab at a middle school, operable canopy using all sail technology. And in 2014, I designed and curated an exhibition at the USC School of Architecture regarding sailing and architecture. And taking these examples of product design and industrial design from sailing, thinking about how these materials and how these forms might influence new ways to build, new ways to create architecture. In collaboration with Professor Amy Murphy, who's with us today, we designed this project called Message in a Bottle, which was FRP, fiber reinforced polymer, fiberglass, as a sculpture and also a point of community interaction where students would actually put messages in a bottle. We did this in collaboration with the USC libraries, so with Shemaine Tucker and with Stacy Williams at our own art and architecture library. And we worked together to think how we might make a point of community at a local fountain at the engineering school at USC. And this relationship between prefabrication and new materials and community became of interest to me. To think about how new technologies might influence not only new sustainable futures, but new ways that we might live together. This is a test chamber using the same technology in collaboration with Professor Doris Sung. And then working with students with the materials themselves. So doing several studios where the students worked with me to create exhibitions of their work, both at the school and outside of the school. This is in the city of Santa Monica, showcasing new residential typologies for prefabricated housing units. And the students have actually made parts and fabricated mock-ups of what these might be. Students later on went on to create larger mock-ups and create building systems using FRP, thinking about how these modular constructions might influence building technology. These students were graduate students of mine, 2 teams that won national places in the American Composites Manufacturing Awards competition in 2017, fabricating their own parts and designing these buildings. This is a project that the students, one of the teams, went on to win an AIA LA award as the top student project in 2017, using composite parts. At the same time, again, just continuing with the personal narrative, how it connects to the research, I was serving as the president of the Los Angeles Forum for Architecture and Urban Design. And at the time, one of the things in 2018 that I really focused on was housing, and this idea of housing and its relationship with social justice, how the housing crisis in Los Angeles was disproportionately affecting communities of color, and the degree to which housing was really a right, as we saw increased housing problems escalate in Los Angeles, problems that have not gone away. So in some of the programming that we looked at regarding housing and housing as intervention and activism in architecture, I also was thinking about natural disaster and thinking about climate change. The house that I showed in the initial slide here ended up on the cover of the LA Times when it was destroyed by the Woolsey fire in 2018. So this thinking about resilience and the idea of natural disaster and sustainability, while we thought about housing as a crisis in the city of Los Angeles, was the confluence of 2 ideas that really informed my thinking on the topic, and something that I've spoken about in interviews and written about. The grant for which I applied and received from the USC School of Architecture regards composite figures, design innovation toward resilient housing communities in Los Angeles, thinking about how in the 21st century we might design these new housing communities that are figured in such a way that the modular construction helps to create spaces of community, both for those residents within the housing projects, but also for the neighbors and the neighboring community, that they might have resources figured within the housing design that would actually enhance existing communities within the city. So this is a real collaboration, not only with Professor Bhavna Sharma within our school, but with also Professors Radovich and technician Colvin at the Viterbi School of Engineering, working to actually consider how material science could support these projects. I'm going to show you just a brief sample of student projects. This is Kiko's Babylon Gardens, looking at the relationship between housing in Iraq in Baghdad might be rethought as a typology for prefabricated housing in Los Angeles for these new spaces of community. This is a project looking at the development of an existing building and adaptive reuse of a building where we're going to have housing units both inserted within and on top of, given the lightweight nature of the FRP. This is in downtown Los Angeles. The idea that with the new materials, we might be able to float housing in the ocean and harbor spaces off Los Angeles as well, and be able to ship in and out these prefabricated modules that would interlock. The idea of developing along metro lines, developing thinner and easily assembled housing typologies along our existing public transit corridors and future public transit corridors. New models for co-living that students are developing, ways that the modules may be able to interlock and create individual privatized spaces, but also shared communal amenities, and relate to existing housing communities where they're situated. Ideas that buildings might take on ideas from metabolist ideas of the 1960s, and consider how they may be re-envisioned, not with an initial core as the scaffold, but perhaps an existing building where it could build onto the existing face of the blind wall of a building in a parking structure and exist on the roof as well. Here looking at various figurations of that facade, how that might play out both in elevation and roof plan. And then continuing with the research in other typologies such as backyards, something that the city of Los Angeles has been encouraging through ADU production and permitting, thinking about how backyards may become communal space and shared space within cities, especially where we have single family housing dominant as the housing type, which has become exclusionary for those who can't afford to purchase an entire lot. Looking how we might have new forms of backyard housing. Other communities, for instance, in the Long Beach, looking at how to extend housing in Long Beach and San Pedro, both into the waterway, and to create new community amenities there that are currently missing in both in terms of outdoor recreation space, ideas of aqua farming, and other sustainable community initiatives. Looking at hillside developments that might be able to be built in wildfire areas and to become more sustainable as housing could become accessible in those places that are not financially accessible. And then I might just say that some of the newest studies that are in progress this year that won't be finished for another month, looking at building modular units that can move on the rail lines. This is Coxie Hernandez working on that. And or Luis Rohier looking to build on top of existing strip malls. So ways to build within LA's existing infrastructure. And with that, I will stop my share. I think we're at 15 minutes. So.
Thank you. You guys have been awesome on the timing, and I just wish we had the full time. So thank you so much. Let's see. Sarah, are you, oops, there goes my timer. Sarah, are you here, and could you answer that first question that I posed in the chat? I could read it if you needed me to. Perhaps not. Okay, so I have another for Yolande from Mike Clark. Let's see. Yolande references the Interstate 10 skirting the USC campus. This may be one of many examples for preferential treatment given to infrastructural planning due to capital power. How can we prevent these planning biases in the future? with so much past infrastructure funding, LA River examples, and future generations of bridges going towards the Army Corps of Engineers, do you see it as a responsibility of the architect to get involved in these infrastructure projects?
That's a good question. It's a big question. I think it's a question that I ask myself, like with the research that I'm doing. For me, the question is, you know, what does it lead to? What's next? And in a sense, you know, one version of what's next is actually becoming engaged in, you know, projects that are on the ground or projecting forward to future projects. So I think it is a good question. I do think there is a need for architects and urban designers and urban planners to be more engaged. And I really like the approach that Allison is taking with her, with the students that she's working with, where they are researching similar things in regards to water, but then also working with communities. So I think it's happening. For me in particular, I haven't been doing that work yet, but it's definitely something to consider. Thank you.
Anybody else want to show either hands or unmute themselves? Probably for any other questions. Panelists could speak to each other's work as well. I have one question, maybe someone can answer, is just what is the impact of these grants on your work? I mean, fundamentally, did it shift, expand? You know, what is the evidence of the effectiveness of these type, you know, Allison and I were texting or chatting, you know, I love hearing what everyone's doing. So in a way, it's getting everybody out of the woodwork and sharing the work. I think that's really important so we can all build on each other's contributions. But is there any, for students that are listening, you know, why are professors being paid to look at this stuff? It's, you know, Jeff's is maybe architectural in some way, and Allison's directly landscape, and Rebecca's historian. You know, everyone has their, and Melissa as well. I mean, everyone has their, you know, reason of how this relates to their own identity. But what's most valuable about taking on these projects for you all?
I'll just respond. I mean, I highlighted those 6 student faces in the beginning just to identify that this research fund has enabled me to work with students where they're actively involved in the sustained nature of it. I mean, I hope, you know, Jared and Lauren, they'll graduate, but I'm still hoping that they can stay connected in some way. And so this has really offered the opportunity, I see Jared, really offered the opportunity to work with students across scales. I mean, just like Yolande said, like we're working at the large scale systemic, understanding the whole region and trying to really get as engaged with communities as possible as we've been able to during COVID. Obviously, there's been a lot of limitations on that, but we hope that that'll transform soon enough.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say how great it was to see each person's research. And even though there's a kind of individual focus behind the research, what was really interesting to me was how, in a way, interconnected the projects were. You know, we overlapped a lot, and it was just really interesting to see different approaches toward the same thing, like different approaches looking at the way that spatial practices, the way that social practices, social ideas are impacting spatial practices, you know, that it's not a neutral thing in the way that we design spaces, even when we're not designing that it's impacting the spaces. So I really appreciated, I feel like I learned a lot from the different presentations and just, I don't know, feel inspired. The research grant was essential to me, like just getting the work done, being able to fund students to help, and then like, you know, just to have the time to look at this work, that was essential. And, the grant was amazing for that.
I had the same impression because when I saw these projects, I thought about this is one big project with similar, like with different building blocks. That was amazing, I was kind of taken aback. Why? I mean, we should have done this earlier.
Yeah.
We kind
Well,
of,
the
the
beginning.
next round should be kind of bringing everybody together to see what they're doing. Not just we saw the announcement who's getting the grants for what projects, but I think this kind of exchange would have been great at the very beginning as well, or in the middle of the year. I don't know.
Yes.
I wanted to also echo the observation that all of us have a kind of like there's so much overlap, both in method, even though the objects of study are so different, the kinds of questions and approaches are quite similar. And I suppose for me, the research grant was also pivotal because I think, as Yolanda sort of indicated in her own research, the more complicated the language of legislation is, the more you can see that there is some more digging to be done and to sort of find the sort of dark underbelly of things that look at first glance race neutral. And for me, the research grant really gave me like just space, time, and the funds to get photocopies from the Smithsonian that costs like 33 cents per sheet, like just like basic things to be able to read through documents and to start a paper trail, almost like an investigative reporter or like a good litigator putting forward a case. So yeah.
Sierra, great to have you back. And again, you were at the beginning of all this, and I think you really kicked this off in such a way. So I don't know if you saw the question that Ruth posed in the chat, but I could read it for you. Do you mind trying to answer that one, or Sierra, maybe?
I did, yeah, I saw the question. Okay. I just wanted to first say thank you guys for having me. I enjoyed everyone's presentation, and having been in affordable housing for the last 25 years, I can say that each one of your presentations touch on a lot of the issues that are going on in affordable housing. Allison, I really enjoyed yours. I've worked, prior to working for Skid Row Housing Trust, I worked for Cabrillo Economic Development Corporation, which specialized in farm worker housing. And I can tell you that everything that you mentioned are all things that contribute to, to the need for affordable housing, especially among farm workers. So everybody's